For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Pastor Brandon. I am the lead pastor of our church. We are finishing up this 3-month journey that we've been on through the book of Judges today. Finally, we're done with Judges. Last week, I introduced you to our last judge, a guy by the name of Samson. And when I introduced you to Samson, I warned you that Samson was the he-man with a she weakness. That Samson had this extraordinary gift from God where the Spirit of the Lord, basically, he would step into the anointing and God would give him supernatural strength, superhuman strength. So it was undebatable that there was something unique about Samson. And this man that God would give extraordinary strength to, in fact, he was like a one-man army, unfortunately, had a weakness for Philistine women. Where we left off in the story, the Israelites had been approached by the Philistines and told, you need to turn over Samson. That Samson has become a problem. In fact, if you don't turn Samson over to us, we're going to kill all of you. So the Bible tells us that 3,000 Israelites went to Samson and basically pleaded with Samson to give up. So they tied Samson up and began to bring him over to the Philistine army. And immediately when Samson sees the Philistines, they start running at him, yelling. And the Bible tells us that the Spirit of the Lord came on Samson. Samson said, don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. And he snaps the ropes and he looks around for the only thing he could find, which was a donkey jawbone. And you might remember last week, I actually tracked down a donkey jawbone. I didn't bring it this week, sorry. And he charged the Philistines. The Bible tells us that he struck down 1,000 Philistines in that moment. And then the last verse that I read was Judges chapter 15, verse 20. And it tells us that from that point on, after striking down the 1,000 Philistines, that Samson led Israel for the next 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Everybody bow your heads, close your eyes. I want everyone to repeat this prayer after me. Everyone say, Dear Jesus, speak to my heart, change my life. In Jesus' name, amen. So you might remember at the very beginning, the Philistines were ruling over the Israelites for 40 years. But in the middle of those 40 years, there was a little bit of a reprieve when Samson, for 20 of them, was leading them. And the end of verse 20 and the beginning of chapter 16 and verse 1 is a huge gap in time. In fact, if this was a movie, there'd be a subtitle that would say 20 years later. And then 20 years later, we get to chapter 16, verse 1, and it updates us on Samson. And here it is. One day, Samson went to Gaza, which was a region where the majority of the Philistines were living at this point in time when they were occupying Israel, where Samson saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. The people of Gaza were told, Samson is here. So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, at dawn we'll kill Samson. I told you last week that Samson is impulsive. That the person of Samson is prone to indulgence. Samson loved to flirt with compromise. And last week I warned you that if you flirt with fire, you will eventually get burned. Now we see Samson, 20 years after leading Israel, 20 years of flirting with compromise, and to be honest, he's no longer flirting with compromise. He's full on indulging in it. Now we see Samson, and he's hooking up with Philistine prostitutes. Samson is like many of us, in that he has mastered the art of compartmentalizing his life. You know the way it works. Okay, here's my church life. Here's my work life. and here's my secret life. We've become really good at living this multiple lives. The problem is, Jesus wants our entire life. He wants all of you, 100%. Now, before I really dive into this story, I gotta warn you, this story is painful. Like the end of our Judges series is going to be like this harsh reminder. And throughout this series, we've really tried to do two things. We've tried to warn you and give you hope. And Judges ends with a very stern warning. So buckle up and get ready. The amazing thing about Samson, though, in this setting is that once again, even though he compromised, God used him. So we've talked over and over again about how God gives us, I called it the safety net of grace. And at the very beginning, I pulled out my handy dandy Husky umbrella. And we know around here, what is the purpose of an umbrella? What does an umbrella do? This protects us from the storm. That we have a lot of room to maneuver underneath this umbrella and be protected from the storm. In fact, this umbrella is large enough where actually a couple of us, if we wanted to get really close, could actually be protected from the storm. And it is representative of the way that God's grace operates in our lives. That God has this umbrella, this safety net of grace for you and I. That within our Christian lives, He gives us the freedom to mess up, make mistakes, trip, screw up within the safety net and the protection of His grace. Meaning that we can do something foolish and not reap the consequences of our actions. That sometimes we can make a bad decision and actually not experience the normal end result of our decision. But the problem is, if we flirt with compromise for too long, we step outside of that umbrella of grace. And once we step outside of that covering of grace, we experience the full result of the consequences of our actions, the end result of the decisions that we make. Well, Samson, even though he was full on indulging in compromise, God was still using him. In fact, the Bible tells us that Samson found out that the Philistines were going to kill him. So he snuck out in the middle of the night and he went to the city gate. Now, these city gates were huge. When you opened up a city gate, you could fit several chariots through at the same time. So this was a huge gate. And Samson, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him again, and he grabbed the city gate, ripped it out of the ground, carried it up on top of a hill, placed it on a hill that overlooked the city of Gaza to basically stick it to the Philistines in Gaza. And the whole time, Samson is thinking, once again, I messed up, but God still used me. And we start thinking when we get into this habit that compromise isn't that big a deal. The problem is the prophet Hosea talked about the Israelites in this season of their life, and he said, your sins have been your downfall. The prophet Isaiah said it this way. He said, this sin will become for you like a high wall, cracked and bulging, that collapses suddenly in an instant. And he uses this metaphor and he says, when you and I continue to flirt with compromise and continue to indulge in sin, it is like we are a wall that slowly gets cracks in it. And it eventually begins to bulge out. And I want to warn you that when this wall comes crashing down, it doesn't happen progressively. Like when all of a sudden the full weight of the responsibility and consequences of the actions that you've made comes down, it is like a roof caving in. It happens suddenly. The campus pastors kind of quoted a phrase that I say often, and I want to remind you again, and it is, sin will take you farther than you wanted to go. Sin will keep you longer than you wanted to stay. And sin will always cost you more than you ever wanted to pay. All of Samson's flirtation with compromise is about to cost him a lot, because along comes Delilah. And this he-man with the she-weakness, this man mightily anointed by God, with a weakness for Philistine women, had met his match. In verse 4, it says, sometime later, so we don't know how long it was, but it was sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, see if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so that we may tie him up and subdue him. Then it says, each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. So once again, Samson falls for the wrong woman. And I think it's safe to say that Samson, he was mesmerized by Delilah. He was full on, head over heels in love with Delilah. And Delilah, she was in love too. She just wasn't in love with Samson. Delilah was in love with money. And the appeal and enticement of 140 pounds of silver was enough for her to full on seduce and manipulate and betray this man. And so she eventually comes to Samson in one of their intimate moments and says, Samson, tell me the secret of your strength and how you can be subdued. Other translations don't use the word subdued. They use the word bound. It's clear, first off, that it wasn't obvious the source of Samson's strength. I told you guys at the beginning of last week that Samson is not like all of these imagery that you've seen growing up if you grew up in church about Samson. Samson is not this big, huge, kind of muscle-bound behemoth. It's very obvious here that the source of his strength wasn't clear. That he looked kind of like you and I. He was an ordinary person. And to Delilah, he may look ordinary, but there was no doubt Samson had supernatural strength. But Delilah knew that everyone is bound by something. Did you know that you are bound by something? That every single one of us has an area of weakness. That every single one of us can be bound by something. It doesn't matter if you're the most spiritual person here, you have an Achilles heel. Even Superman has kryptonite. So every one of us has our kryptonite. Every one of us has our area of weakness. For Samson, it was Philistine women. I'm telling you, church, you are in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. You are capable of doing the wrong thing. As a Nazirite, Samson wasn't even to flirt with compromise. Like when he took the Nazirite vow and lived his life as a Nazirite, he was to avoid the very appearance of temptation and compromise. He was supposed to go in the entire opposite direction. And when anybody saw Samson, it was obvious to them that he had taken a Nazirite vow. Why? Because he had never cut his hair. In fact, the Bible says his hair had grown so long that it was woven into 7 different braids. And whenever people saw Samson, they thought, oh, that is a Hebrew that has taken the Nazirite vow. And whenever they saw him, there is an expectation of the way that a Nazirite should act and behave. That they saw him and there was an assumption of things that he would do and things that he would not do. Can I tell you just a reality? If you were here and you were a follower of Jesus, if you're here and you were a Christian, did you know that your neighbors have an expectation of you? That just by the very nature of you being a Christian, those at work have figured out that you are a Christian. And because of that, there's an expectation of what you would do and what you would not do. Just by the nature of being a Christian. So Samson decides that he's going to continue to flirt with compromise. So he's kind of messing around with Delilah, and he says, anyone who ties me up with 7 fresh bowstrings, I become like any ordinary man. So Delilah waits until Samson falls asleep, and she ties him up with 7 bowstrings, and then she wakes him up suddenly by shouting, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. Immediately, Samson gets up, hears Philistine, thinks, I don't like these guys, and immediately snaps those 7 bowstrings and looks around for the Philistines. Delilah realizes she'd been duped, so she asks again. Did you know that sin will make you do crazy things? Did you know that sin will sometimes cause you to check your brain at the door? I mean, sin will blind you. Sin will make it so you don't even realize what is sitting in front of you, what's totally obvious. I've shared many times with our church over the years that there is an evolution of sin in our life. I call it the evolution of compromise. And it starts when you do something you know you shouldn't do, you immediately are consumed by guilt. So it starts with guilt. But if you eventually continue to do it, it sears your conscience. And you shift from guilt into denial. So you will find somebody that's fully indulging in sin, things that they had known previously they shouldn't do, but now they deny that it's even wrong. And if you live in that denial for long enough, you transition to indifference. And indifference is where you just don't feel anything anymore. You just don't care. You know, maybe it is wrong. Maybe it's not wrong. But frankly, you just don't care anymore. And once you get to the point of indifference, get afraid because you are leading to death. Guilt, denial, indifference, death. So this time, Delilah does what Samson says. She ties him up with some brand new ropes. And I want to point out that this time, she doesn't even wait until he's asleep. She does it while he's awake. Samson allows himself to be bound. Why? Because Samson liked the situation. Man, he liked the flirting with compromise. He liked the messing around with Delilah. Did you know that oftentimes people refuse to escape addiction or compromise? You know why? Because they like the high. They like the way it feels. It feels good. I like to tell everybody all the time that sin is fun initially. If sin wasn't fun, no one would do it. But it entices you. It seduces you. The problem, sin will take you farther than you wanted to go. It'll keep you longer than you wanted to stay. And it'll ultimately cost you more than you ever wanted to pay. You experience the progression of compromise, guilt, denial, indifference, death. And when you get to that point, you just don't even care anymore. And that's where Samson's getting. So Delilah tries a third time. Do you know that sin cares nothing for you? That sin is hell-bent on one thing: destroying your life. Sin is relentless. Compromise will blind you. You can't even see what's before your eyes. Here is Samson, and he is so blinded with irresponsible love that he cannot see what Delilah's endgame is. It's one of the reasons that we always encourage you to guard your heart. Delilah comes to Samson and she says, Samson, your heart is not with me. Man, you don't really love me. Your heart is not with me. Can I tell you that compromise can be a manipulative she-devil? It'll tell you what you want to hear. It'll play your heartstrings. But mark my word, its sole goal is destruction. And it's one of the things that I think is the most complicated for us to actually accept and believe. Because we live in a day and age where it's hard for us to accept that people can just be evil. That there can just be something that has one aim, and that is to destroy our life, to hurt us. Whenever I talk to like the under 30 crowd about the war on ISIS, it makes no sense. When they hear our political leaders say things like, we just need to wipe them off the planet. We just need to kill them. To our under 30 crowd, because they're so far separated from actually seeing and experiencing this type of violence, they cannot comprehend that people are just evil. They cannot comprehend that there are people that just hate. That there are people that just because of who you are want to kill you. They cannot comprehend that there is actually that type of person or that type of thing. And I want to warn you that that is sin. That all it wants to do is destroy your life. It wants to mess up your marriage, mess up your finances, destroy your health, and bind you in addiction. That's why Solomon said, above all else, guard your heart. And then he goes on and he explains why. He says, because it determines the course of your life. Jesus said, where your heart is, there's your treasure. Whoever give you a heart to, that's what you treasure the most. The problem is Samson had ripped out his heart and he'd given it to Delilah. Because compromise will convince you, I must have this. Twists our thinking. That's why you must guard your heart. Church, once you give your heart away, I work with young people. Our church is full of young people, and I watch it over and over again. When you give your heart away, you give your brain away too. Like your brain goes with it. So finally, Delilah's fed up with Samson, and she tries a final time to get him to tell her the secret of his strength. Church, sin will chase after you. Sin doesn't stop. When sin has you in its sight, it shows no mercy. That's why Peter said, be alert and of sober mind. Other translations, he says, keep watch. In other words, keep your eyes open. Because your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Do you realize that sin has a prey and it's you? It's me. That when we're vulnerable, it will pounce. And when we're in its territory, it is relentless and ferocious. The Bible tells us that Delilah, with such nagging, prodded Samson day after day until he was sick to death of it. It's the reason why Paul told Timothy, all that stuff you're tempted to do when you're young, just run away from it. Flee the evil desires of your youth. When temptation comes, turn around, run the other direction. Get away. Escape from it. Flee from it. In other words, that you got to be smart with the way you live your life. You got to realize what you're bound with and what you struggle with and what is your kryptonite. If you are someone and you struggle with alcohol, run away from bars. If you're someone and you have a gambling addiction, you probably should vacation somewhere other than Las Vegas. I mean, if you are someone and you struggle with drugs, don't go to concerts. If you are someone who struggles with lust, stay away from Philistine women. Because sin can wear you down. Even the strongest person. Other translations tell us that Delilah pressured Samson daily and eventually got sick to death of it. Samson eventually couldn't stand strong anymore. I bet there was a point, Samson's, he's living under this umbrella of grace, and he is flirting with compromise like crazy. In fact, he's full on indulging in it, and he's getting away with it. There's no consequences. I mean, the Spirit of the Lord still uses him. And I bet Samson, there came a point where Samson just thought, man, I've been compromising for the last 20 years, and I've gotten away with it. What does it matter if I compromise this one more time? And frankly, who really cares? And he steps outside of that umbrella of grace. And the Bible tells us that Samson told her everything. Probably a better translation of that verse is that he told her everything that was in his heart. Basically, Samson says, Delilah, here's my heart. I choose this ungodly relationship over my faithfulness to God. Can I tell you, don't let the enemy lie to you. And his greatest lie is he's going to try to tell you can have both. He's going to let you think you can live in both worlds. But eventually, that wall that has cracks in it, that's bulging, it's going to come crashing down. And when it does, it's going to happen suddenly. And sin always costs us more than we ever want to pay. Because you can't have both forever. And here we see the strongest man in the world weak under the power of an ungodly relationship. And he tells Delilah that no razor has ever touched my head. That if my head is shaved, I'll become like any ordinary man. And then the Bible tells us this. It says, Delilah lulled Samson to sleep in her lap. Isn't that just the way the enemy works? I mean, he lulls us to sleep. In almost this sweet, innocent setting where it seems simple and safe at first, and then sin pounces. Verse 19, after putting Samson to sleep in her lap, Delilah called for someone to come and shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. And then Delilah shouts once again to wake him up out of his sleep, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. She begins to torment him. Did you know that once sin has your heart, it is merciless. It torments you. We had a highlight from CR from Rob Hayden earlier. And I've talked to many of the people that have gone through our Celebrate Recovery program. And to a person, they will tell you their addiction started fun. I mean, it started just like as a way to escape. It started just as a high to not deal with the reality of life. But then once it had their heart, sin, addiction was hell-bent on destruction. They will tell you to a person, they watched their lives unravel. They watched their marriages fall apart. They watched everything in their life be destroyed. Because once compromise has your heart, it wants to destroy you. She wakes Samson up. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And the Bible says, Samson thought, I'm going to break out just like I have before. But the Bible says, he did not know that the Lord had left him. If you have your Bible, underline that line. Highlight that. Circle it. Put stars by it. Now, I need you to realize something, that his hair had nothing to do with it. Like many people, they tell the story of Samson like he had some sort of supernatural hair. It was not his hair. His hair was symbolic of his heart. And as his head was shaved, it showed the hardness of his heart. Because if you flirt with fire, you are eventually going to get burned. And let me tell you, if you flirt with sin, sin can eventually own you. Samson stepped outside of that umbrella of grace. The full results of his actions came. And he did not know that the Spirit of God had left him. You know why? Because he got so comfortable living this dualistic life. Man, he couldn't tell when God was with him or God wasn't. I mean, sometimes we get so used to like playing the little church game, playing the little Christian game. And then, we play one way at church and we're the other way when we're not at church. We get so used to living this way, we can't even tell when we're one place or the other. But he did not know the Spirit of God had left him. Guilt, denial, indifference, death. In sin, once it has you, it shows no mercy. No longer masked under Delilah's beauty, sin just destroys. The Bible says the Philistines seized Samson. They took sticks and gouged out his eyes. And they made him a slave grinding at a wheel. Isn't that just an encouraging way to end this series? I do want to encourage you, that is not the end of the story. I mean, if that was the end of the story, what a depressing series this was. But I have good news for you. I have hope for you. I have good news and hope for those that you love. The Bible says that the hair on Samson's head began to grow again after it had been shaved. My favorite verse to quote is Jeremiah 15:19. I love this verse so much that it's tattooed on the back of one of my legs. And it's this great reminder. We talked last week about the Bible is full of these if-then promises that if you do this, then God will do this. Well, this verse says, if you repent, He will restore you that you may serve Him. And I've told you many times before that word restore in its original language means instantaneously brought back to that place you were before. So while God's anointing was no longer resting on Samson, God hadn't left him. God was still near. I mean, the word tells us over and over again that He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. God was just waiting for Samson to admit he'd messed up, made mistakes, hadn't lived right. He was waiting for him to repent and say, Lord, I am not going to do that anymore, so that God could forgive him and restore him. And the Bible tells us that Samson, as he's grinding as a slave, all of a sudden, he realized that his hair had grown back. I can imagine probably what happened is Samson's alone and miserable and in pain. And one day he felt the hair on the back of his neck again. He probably reached up, felt that hair, and in that moment remembered God. And he began to remember how good God had been to him. Now, I bet he began to remember kind of the crazy things that God had given him the strength and ability to do. And in that moment, we don't know where, we don't know when, we don't know how, but it is safe to assume that Samson repented. He said, Lord, I have messed up. I have really made some seriously bad decisions. And he says, but God, will you forgive me? And then the Lord is like, that's what I was waiting for, Samson. Yes, you were restored. So the end of the story is all the Philistine leaders, all of the Philistine leaders, thousands of them had gathered in this building. And they began to chant, bring out Samson so we can make fun of him. And that was because Samson represented to them all of their enemies that they'd defeated and won. And so they brought this blind, broken, beaten Samson up onto the stage. And the person that was helping him drug him out as the crowd began to yell. And Samson tells the person, can you lean me up against one of the pillars so that I can hold myself up? But what the Philistines don't know is that Samson has been restored. And then the Bible tells us, verse 30, it says, Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And then a newly restored Samson, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him again, and he pushed against those pillars with all of his might. And he took the whole building down. And then the story ends, thus Samson killed many more when he died than when he lived. Church, I want to warn you that sin will take you farther than you wanted to go. It'll keep you longer than you wanted to stay, and it will cost you more than you ever wanted to pay. But God is here. He's for you. He loves you. And if you repent, He'll restore you that you may serve him. Everyone bow your heads, close your eyes.